Right, so let's keep talking about the idea or this process called macroevolution and speciation. And what is it and how does it happen? And remember in the first lecture we talked about population A over time, developing differences within the population, and eventually a split occurring and those individuals evolving into different species. We're just going to call them B and C for simplification. And then B and C, there's enough differences that they cannot come back together. They can't reproduce with each other and recreate A. So this idea of bring it back and let's go back and basically reverse it, it doesn't work. It doesn't happen. That's not the way natural processes occur. And the reason for that block are these things we call isolating mechanisms. So in the first lecture we talked about prezygotic, things that don't allow the two different species to reproduce. Even though they're very similar, they can't reproduce because they're blocked with these isolating mechanisms. We talked about what we called prezygotic, no reproduction, no zygote. So last lecture we talked about the mechanism of habitat isolation, temporal isolation, and behavioral isolation. All prezygotic, blocks mating. We also want to talk about a mechanical isolation. So you live in the same pond, you have a similar breeding season, you can somewhat figure out the dance, but your reproductive structures don't fit. Basically, anatomically, it doesn't work. Big frog, little frog, probably not going to work out well. Okay, that's another natural mechanism in place. So what I want you guys to consider, think about domesticated dogs. Are they all the same species? We use the term breed to say, oh, well, my breed is, I have a Labrador, I have a German Shepherd, I have a Pit Bull, I have a Rottweiler, etc. What happens, or what do we do with dogs when we get to a point where you have two different breeds that cannot reproduce? Let's take a St. Bernard and a Chihuahua. Not pleasant to think about. They have become mechanically isolated. Have they then become different species? So it's an interesting question, no real clear answer, but something we want to think about. All right, now one last prezygotic block is called gamete isolation. So you live in the same area, you reproduce at the same time, you know the dance and the song and the parts fit, but your sperm cannot fertilize the egg. So there's a mechanism here. The sperm cells have these tiny little caps on them right here. It's called the chromosomal cap, the little tip of the sperm. It's a protein structure. That protein structure is what allows it to actually penetrate into the egg for fertilization. So this little guy here, let's just make it up. An example, he has a cap on with a protein structure that looks like a letter T. The egg has a protein receptor that looks like the letter U. Sperm's not going to fertilize that egg because it won't get into the egg. So that is one more natural isolating mechanism that is in place to prevent two different species from reproducing and trying to, in a sense, work back towards the original species. Those are all prezygotic. Now sometimes all of this happens, mating happens, it occurs, and reproduction happens. Then we get into what's called post-zygotic isolating or isolation mechanisms. Okay, so with post-zygotic, the zygote has formed. Fertilization, zygote, is formed, but the offspring doesn't develop correctly. So there's a thing called zygote mortality. the zygote doesn't survive. It simply dies. It starts to go through the cell cycle, but because the DNA is mixed up and it's not the correct information, it will not continue the cell cycle. So again, imagine taking 23 chromatids. So you got 23 chromatids from the egg and 26 from the sperm. You put them together. You don't want 49. That's the wrong number. It should be 23 and 23. 23 from the egg, the same exact number from the sperm, combining. Now you have your full complement of DNA. So that is what we call a post-zygotic mechanism. Fertilization has occurred, offspring doesn't develop. Sometimes it dies before the zygote even really gets going in development. Now, there are cases where, all right, they worked it out. All those pre-zygotic blocks were, in a sense, ignored, and they produced an offspring. But the offspring is sterile. And our example is, take a horse and a donkey. You have a mule. Mules are sterile. You don't take mules and breed mules to make more mules. You take a horse and a donkey. And depending on if you have a horse, which is the male and the female, you get donkeys versus jackasses. It stops there. Now, are horses and donkeys related with a common ancestor? Absolutely. But are we going to see that evolutionary line come back together? So here's your horse, here's your donkey. They have a common ancestor. Back here, will horse and donkey ever come back together and recreate the common ancestor? No, because this only happens for one generation. Remember, to evolve and split right here, going from the original ancestral A population and then splitting into horses and donkeys, that took millions of years. So you can't recreate the original population or species in one generation. Mules are sterile. It's what we call hybrid sterility. On a very rare occasion will we see two hybrids, two mules, reproducing. This then goes into what we call F2 fitness. The offspring from the F2 doesn't survive. So, okay, we got our two mules together, we male and female, and they reproduced, but then now the F2 generation doesn't make it. That mule doesn't survive. So, okay, maybe you get two generations going, but then it's done. Evolution takes lots of generations. All right, so what all of this leads up to is speciation. Speciation is the splitting of one species into two different species. All right, that's what speciation is. One species splits and becomes two different ones. Now, when we look at speciation, there's two different modes of speciation, two different ways that this happens. First mode is called allopatric speciation. This is where the population is divided by a physical barrier. So there's something physical separating the population, splitting it, isolating them, and causing them to develop differently. So you take a look at the wrasses here, blue-headed wrasse, and then the Cortez rainbow wrasse. So let's go back a couple million years. North America, South America were not connected. There was a gap there, right there. And the wrasses were swimming around, the ancestral wrasses were all swimming around this area of the ocean. So you had wrasse population A. But then as the continents drifted and connected, it created a physical barrier. So now all of a sudden you have a barrier. Some of the wrasse is over on this side, and some of those fish are over on this side. And over time, differences developed. Consider the differences in the water temperature, the water current, the nutrients, the predators, the environmental exposure, sunlight, temperature, wind, etc. All those things are going to be different on the Atlantic side versus the Pacific side of that area of the ocean. So that's going to cause the A population to split and diverge and eventually produce the B and C population of wrasses. Blue-headed wrasses, Cortez rainbow wrasses, because of a physical barrier. So sometimes that happens. And it doesn't have to be massive. It could simply be a river divides a field in half. As long as it separates the population and splits them, remember the picture of the mice in the previous chapter, now you have differences on each side of that river, each side of that physical barrier that prevents the populations from interbreeding, and that can lead to speciation. The other example or mode of speciation is called sympatric. Now with sympatric, in sympatric speciation, the population is divided by changes in behavior, feeding preferences, reproductive preferences, etc. All those things cause populations to split. So our diagram here, you have one population that's all yellow and all of a sudden purple shows up. Maybe those individuals migrated in, or those individuals had mutations, etc. And now all of a sudden we start seeing differences. And the purple ones reproduce with the purple ones. The yellow ones reproduce with the yellow. And over time, the yellows are changing and evolving into red, but the purple's still staying purple. And they basically just drift apart. Now, physically, they're in the same environment, but because purple likes purple and yellow likes yellow and yellow evolves to red and red likes red, you see this separation in your species. Maybe you're feeding on a different food source than the other members of your population, and you start to specialize in certain food sources. In ecology, we call this niche specialization, where, all right, I'm a certain bird, my population, we feed on insects. I'm a similar bird, but I'm going to feed on seeds. And over time, we develop different physical attributes that specialize us in feeding on insects or seeds. And then that eventually can lead to speciation. So it is a very long, slow, tenuous process for speciation to occur. It's just, what is the mechanism in place that really kind of prompts it? Is it that physical barrier, or is it more of the behavioral barrier that leads to speciation? So when we look at populations, we often see adaptive radiation occurring. You have an ancestral species, and that gives rise to multiple new species that are adapted to specific environments. So our Hawaiian honey creepers are an example here. They all trace their ancestral origin back to this ancestral stem population, and then over time they started evolving in different directions, different physical features and traits, thus presenting the tree-based diagram here, and this is what leads to the diversity we have out there. The example here is the diversity of honey creepers. They're all related to a common ancestral population that underwent speciation and caused them to diverge and speciate into different species. Now, they can't come back together. They can't reproduce because of those mechanisms that are in place that block different species from reproducing with each other. Oh, sorry, let me get back there. So, all right, so in the last lecture, we're going to talk about the macroevolution side of things. What happens when all these little changes accumulate and build up over the course of long, long periods of time? What do we see there?